This very moment, Donald Trump's own aides are on edge, and they are concerned about what might happen tonight in Cincinnati. This at Donald Trump's first campaign rally since Greenville, North Carolina. That is where the crowd infamously erupted in those chants of "send her back" to no objection from the president. That incident kicking off weeks now of controversy around the subject of race, in part because Trump himself has been fanning those flames, at least according to Democrats. And today, his aides are worried he will use his turn at the podium to venture right back into fraught territory that they cannot seem to keep him away from. Right now, Trump is talking to reporters before he heads out to Cincinnati, commenting on what he might do tonight if the crowd does break into those chants again. The Associated Press is reporting, quote, all eyes will be watching both the Ohio crowd's behavior and how Trump reacts. Even his closest advisors seem uncertain as to what may transpire. And precedent suggests that Trump might have extra motivation to dial up the divisiveness in order to put focus away from his Democratic rivals. We certainly know that Trump was watching last night's debate along with the rest of us. He was tweeting right alongside, which means he probably would have seen at least some of the 40 separate attacks from those candidates on his leadership, on his conduct, and on his policies.
Mr. President, this is America, and we are strong and great because of this diversity, Mr. President, not in spite of it, Mr. President.
Mr. President, kids belong in classrooms, not cages.
When we look back in history at what happened when a president of the United States started acting more like an authoritarian leader than the leader of the free world, the question is what will we have done?
He needs to be held accountable. I've seen people go to prison for far less.
On January 20th, 2021, we'll say together, adios to Donald Trump.
And that is the picture Democrats were trying to paint last night. Donald Trump as a race-baiting, corrupt breaker of promises. So it is worth noting that just as the candidates were about to take the stage, Trump retweeted yet another controversial attack video on the conditions in Baltimore. Here to talk us through all of this, Phil Rucker, White House bureau chief for The Washington Post and White House correspondent for PBS NewsHour, Yamiche Alcindor. At the table with us here, former Democratic Congresswoman Donna Edwards, executive editor for Bloomberg Opinion, Tim O'Brien, plus politics editor for The Root, Jason Johnson. Thanks to everybody for being here. Phil, let me just start with you. In terms of the reporting you are hearing at this hour, the president about to head out to Cincinnati, going to have one of those giant rallies. We saw what happened the last time. He said afterwards maybe he wasn't too happy and maybe he'd try to tell the crowd not to do it if it did it again. What's the likelihood the crowd's going to do this again? And what's the likelihood the president would say anything like that if it does?
Yeah, well, Steve, the crowd certainly could do this chant again. I don't know. We'll have to see what happens tonight. But the president is very unlikely to actually admonish his supporters. I don't think we've ever seen him do that in his 3.5 years as a presidential candidate or as a president. And he's leaving the White House right now and was just telling The Pool about this. He was asked by some reporters what would happen if that chant happened again. And he said, quote, if they do the chant, we'll see what happens. But I prefer that they don't. That's according to the White House Pool report. So that's his state of mind as he heads out to Ohio. We'll see what happens tonight, but I can tell you one thing. There's really nothing that his staff or aides can do to force him to handle it one way or another. He's going to probably follow his gut when he's on that stage and decide how to deal with it if it happens. And again, I'd be very surprised if he actually followed through and admonished his own supporters.
Yeah, Yamiche, take us through what's going on behind the scenes. Phil says his aides, all the reporting I've seen, that folks around Trump are uncomfortable, to say the least, about him venturing into this territory and completely incapable of getting the message through to him that he shouldn't. What is the mood around Trump like right now?
Everyone's a bit on edge because the president tweeted out that these 4 congresswomen should go back to their countries and then tried for about a week to pivot away from that to say that they should leave the country. But these supporters understand very clearly what President Trump was saying to them. And I just came back from Ohio, where people there told me that they liked the fact that the president said, send her back. They like the idea of the chants in North Carolina. They say that this is a president who is fighting for America, fighting for Republicans. They feel as though Republicans have been painted as racist racist for some time. So they feel as though the president really is speaking for them and their values. I think aides and the president, at least if his words are to be believed, don't want the crowd there to be chanting this. But the president also is someone who likes these crowds. Even though he disavowed the chant in North Carolina, the next day he called them incredible patriots and incredible Americans. And when I asked him specifically, does that mean that you're trying to walk back that disavowal, he wouldn't answer me. So you have a president who is torn with embracing his supporters and also wanting to not be painted as racist. At least that's what he tells reporters like me and Phil and others.
Yeah, and Jason, what Phil is saying there, what the president apparently just told the press before heading out to Ohio, he's asked, what happens if the crowd starts chanting that tonight? Mm-hmm. His answer is not, I'm going to tell him not to.
Right.
His answer is, we'll see what happens.
Yeah, because that's what he wants. Look, Donald Trump is a racist, and he wants people to be excited about it. He wants his supporters to feel like he is this avatar for all of the racial animus that they want to have. And I think the question here, it's not whether or not Donald Trump is really going to have any impact on his supporters. It's what does that manifest in down the road, right? Because we know this is what's going to happen. I've been to Cameron Indoor Stadium with Duke and Chapel Hill, whatever. You can't stop a chant, okay? People start screaming on the field and start throwing you can't stop a chant, even if you want to. So the question is, how does he decide he wants to weaponize this? Because a bunch of screaming people doesn't provide the best look throughout the rest of Ohio. That doesn't make people in Toledo and Cleveland say, I want to go there. A lot of Americans, even Americans who may be Republicans, will look at that and be like, that kind of looks like a nut house. So that's what I'm curious about. How does he use this going forward? Because he can't stop this behavior, and he won't.
And Tim, he reads everything I can tell about Trump this is somebody, and the reporters who've gotten to know his world a little bit have been saying this. He is fixated on what he sees as his base. And it's sort of tuning out folks who he doesn't perceive to be his base in the interest of catering to them. And there's no purer distillation of what Trump sees as his base than these crowds who show up at these arenas. So if they start chanting it, everything about Trump suggests he's not going to correct them.
Well, the thing to remember is Trump opened the door to this a long time ago. I think it's both healthy and completely depressing that we can acknowledge that we have a president who is a racist, and he has created the conditions for these kinds of events, and he's given them the script. Everything that was said in North Carolina was based on things he himself had said. He's got no interest in pushing back on this, really, for two reasons. One, this is who he is. The president is a racist, and he revels, I think, in throwing these sort of flame balls into the middle of the public dialogue to incent people to feel passionately about things they may have kept in check before. The other thing is, I don't think he sees this in a political framework. If he did, he actually wouldn't be doing this, because he doesn't need to be pandering to the worst instincts of his base. He needs to try to expand his electoral base into swing voters. And as Jason was saying, I think there's a lot of swing voters who are going to test this. We're already seeing suburban white women don't like this. They were a crucial voting bloc that put the Democrats in the House in the 2018 election. And I think that Trump is not being strategic. He's being who he is.
Donna, what do you think?
Well, I think the president revels in the energy of the chanting crowds. I mean, if you look at him, he was basking in that chant, and I think he feeds off of it as well as the crowd feeding off of him. And so I think it's highly unlikely that he's just going to stop it in its tracks, even if he had the ability to do that. The other thing is that I think the president, and Tim, you said this, we acknowledge that he's a racist. And the question, I think, for the rest of us is, what do we do with that? Do we ignore it? Do we move on? And I would argue you don't move on. You really have to hit it head on every single time so that the American public doesn't just become immune to this idea that we have a racist president in the White House.
We've had police studies, we've had sociological studies that show a rise in hate crimes and attacks and racial assaults and attacks in every single community, like a virus, whenever he has one of these conferences or one of these sort of big rallies. So I think that's the other thing we need to talk about. It's like the consequences on the ground of bringing this kind of nonsense together and having people screaming, having people chanting, having him play gladiator emperor with his thumb up or down and having people scream lock her up and everything else like that. We need to look at it from just a pure civic perspective of, okay, well, how many of these people go out and then threaten somebody in a Walmart? And how many of these people go out and then burn a cross? How many of these people go out and then wave a gun at somebody at a gas station? We need to look at these as civil disturbances and an encouragement of sort of domestic terror rather than just a political rally, because that's essentially what they manifest it being.
What Jason's talking about is something that I specifically just came back from hearing about. I was just in Dayton, Ohio, where the mayor there says since the 2000s, that city's population, immigrant population, has doubled. They have all sorts of policies to welcome immigrants. Just last week, somebody was walking in Dayton, again, where immigrants have been welcomed for years now, and someone screamed, "Send her back, go back to your country," to someone walking in that community. And that mayor told me we've been doing years of work, and in one tweet, the president can really drag us back to a time before we were not welcoming immigrants. And I also talked to a family who said they're scared to send their biracial Muslim children to school because they're scared that someone's going to bully them and take the lead from the president. They're scared someone unstable could even hurt their family if they listen to the president's chants and listen to the president's tweets. So this is really something that black and brown people and of course, also allies, white allies, are feeling around the country and has everyone on edge.
The question here, too, there is a question, too, about how Trump's party handles that, certainly handled the last instance of this coming up at a rally. If it were to come up tonight, we will see. If it were to happen again, we will see. You saw, though, that resolution that hit the House floor a couple weeks ago, the Democrats put up. I believe there were 4 Republicans who ended up crossing over and voting with the Democrats on that. The rest, though, voted against it. Here was Trump's vice president. Here was Mike Pence. This was an interview with Major Garrett on CBS just after the last eruption on this topic. This was how Mike Pence addressed it.
This could all go away with one simple word or a phrase or something. You have a chance to say it right now. Well, don't do it again. Is that your message?
Major, the president was very clear.
Was he?
That he wasn't happy about it. And that if it happened again, he'd make an effort to speak out about it.
And Phil Rucker, that was such an extraordinary comment, or certainly seemed to be, from Pence, because you could hear him hedging. You could hear this political instinct that Pence has to condemn this, or at least to distance himself from it, but then to hedge, because it's almost as if he's thinking, hey, maybe this is going to happen again, and I don't want this interview being held up as me saying something different.
Yeah, Steve, it was one of the very few moments, I think, where we've seen Vice President Pence shaky and uncertain, and you might even say weak in his convictions about that answer. And it's worth pointing out also that it wasn't entirely true what he said. President Trump was not clear in what he said about that chant. In fact, it took until the next day for him to say anything, only when reporters asked him, and only after Republican lawmakers urged the vice president to convince President Trump to condemn what had happened in those chants and had started speaking out about it. Trump himself said nothing that night at the rally. He said nothing on Twitter on the way home when it became a huge news story. He said nothing the next morning. It wasn't until later in the day.
This came up sort of indirectly, I think, at the debate last night, the Democratic debate. I think it was Joe Biden's opening statement last night, and we played a little bit of there where he was looking directly into the camera, addressing Mr. President, basically making the argument that the country is different than, is better than the kind of rhetoric the president is putting forward. Is that a message? I remember Democrats raising that point in 2016. And Donald Trump is in the White House now. Is that a message that resonates differently, that plays differently now?
Well, I mean, I do think that there's also a Democratic base, and there's part of that Democratic base that stayed home in 2016. And I think they want to hear leaders really directly confronting this president. I mean, ordinarily, people say, well, move on, sweep it under the rug, don't talk about it because there's some negative consequence. Here is an instance where for Democrats, the negative consequence for them of not speaking out and not confronting this president is that they're going to have a whole set of people going, what's the point of voting for you? And so I think it's actually imperative in this environment to challenge the president every single time, even if you have to then pivot to the issues that people are talking about and they're concerned about health care. Well, the reason you can't get this done is because you've got a racist in the White House who is challenging you on every front. And I think that's a winning message for Democrats.
Yeah, and it strikes me, Tim, watching that last night, as I was mentioning, I do remember this coming up in 2016. And I do remember there were Democrats, I think folks in the Clinton campaign, who were convinced that the basic message of America's better than this would win the election in 2016. And it didn't.
Well, I think one of the differences with 2016 is I don't think the American electorate had a full handle on the nature of the man that was about to go into the White House. I think there was a lot of indicators to people who hadn't been around him a long time. It wasn't a mystery that he was a racist. I think it wasn't a mystery that he was ill-informed. and that he was a race baiter. But a lot of this has burst into the open in a much rawer way now, and I think it's going to reside with the electorate in a different way. You know what Donna was just saying, how imperative it is for Democrats to speak up to this. It's also really imperative for the GOP, and it's still amazing to me that at this point we're now a week beyond Trump's flamethrowing at Elijah Cummings in the city of Baltimore. Not a single member of the GOP, either in Washington or in any of the governor's houses, maybe except for Maryland, has come out and said, and that was equivocal, right? And late and very squishy, has come out and said simply, this is wrong. We're a country that tolerates racial and ethnic and religious diversity, and we celebrate it, and this is the worst of who we are. Obviously, the big example of all this to me is Mark Meadows. Elijah Cummings went to bat for Mark Meadows earlier this year, defended him on the floor of the Congress as not being a racist. Meadows thanked him for that. Has Mark Meadows been seen at all over the last week out in front saying, my good friend Elijah Cummings is being treated horribly by the president? No, and I think that's a proxy for
you had a statement in which he lumped in Cummings and Trump together and said, I don't think they're both racist. The other thing I mentioned, there was that vote in the last eruption of this. There was that vote, that resolution in the House to condemn Trump's comments. 4 Republicans crossed over.
Right.
One of the Republicans who crossed over, Susan Brooks from Indiana, had just announced a few weeks earlier she's retiring. Yeah. And it almost seemed like one of the... But I'm wondering, Phil Rucker, maybe you have some insight into this. We've seen a spate of Republican retirement announcements in the past week. And I'm thinking of the Susan Brooks example I mentioned when I see these other Republicans all of a sudden. So it seems like there's a sudden rush of it. Is it related to the president in the last couple of weeks really stepping up this particular approach?
The truth, Steve, is we don't entirely know, but I don't suspect it's related simply to the news of the last couple of weeks with the racist comments by the president. Rather, it's a reflection of the broader political atmosphere for the Republican Party. They're in the minority in the House right now. Some of these lawmakers may have made a calculation that it's unlikely in a presidential election cycle that they would win back the majority in the House. Life is not as good in the minority as it is in the majority, and maybe they've decided, they don't want to stick it out or they've had enough. That's often the reason why some House members will decide not to run again. And it should certainly also be a reaction to what they see with President Trump, but I don't think these are decisions that they make in sort of a 2-week window. It's something that these lawmakers think about for a long time before deciding and announcing.
You knew... it's been a few years since you were in the House, but you know a lot of the Republicans who are there now. I imagine you have a pretty good sense of what motivates them. You probably have a good sense of some of them as people. We don't hear a lot from them publicly, but what do you think is going on behind the scenes with Republicans in Congress as this sort of thing plays out?
Well, I've thought about this, and I don't actually think now it matters what goes on behind the scenes, because if they whisper behind the scenes that they're uncomfortable with the president, that it makes them worried about their own districts, it doesn't matter because they haven't said anything publicly. And when I look at some of the retirements, I think only one of them is in a district where potentially Democrats could have a pickup. The others are in pretty solidly red districts. And so it seems to me that they're making a twofold calculation. One, they can't be defended by the president anymore. Martha Roby, who's retiring, she had to beg the president for an endorsement because of a close election being challenged on her right. Does she really want to go through that again with this president in the White House? I don't think so. And so I would not be surprised if we saw more of these retirement announcements. And, Republicans right now are pretty feckless. They're co-conspirators. They're complicit in the president's racism. And I've just said, the Republican Party, to me, is like dead. I don't even know how it's going to be reinvented.
It is interesting. The most recent Republican to really come out and make a stand against Trump was Justin Amash on the Question of Mueller report. By the way, Justin Amash is no longer a member of the Republican Party. And I don't know what his prospects are to come back to the House after next year. Anyway.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.